I met Philip on my very first job on my very first day. I remember coming into the ward and I was very nervous, of course, being a new staff in the institution serving people with disabilities. Back in those days, there wasn't much in the way of community service, so I took a job where I could, and the institution wasn't all that far from my home. I remember walking into the locked ward and feeling that I wanted to do something significant. This was my job, this was my career, and it was a passion for me to work with people with disabilities. One of the very first people I met there was a guy whose name was Philip. And I remember him very, very clearly because when I came through the door into the ward, Philip was standing by the window and he looked over at me and recognized me as a new face. And he called out to me and he was very, very excited. And he stood at the window and he looked over at me and he called out, "Poco hor, poco hor." So I went over to Philip, knowing that clearly from his language that he didn't have a great deal of speech. But I looked out the window at what he was pointing at, and I really couldn't identify anything that would be a poco hor. So I looked and I looked and I looked over at him, and he was so excited that I was standing there with him, and he was out the window and he kept pointing, and he was poco hor, poco hor. So I stood there for a while and I didn't understand what it was that he was saying, and I apologized that I wasn't getting his message. So I spoke to some of the other staff, the staff who worked with him for a long period of time, and they told me that this was simply a habit of his, that he would stand at the window and call out poco hor, and they'd done everything they could to figure out what poco hor meant, and they just figured it was just nonsense talk, and it really didn't mean anything. But I had trouble believing that, and the reason I had trouble believing that was because to Philip it clearly meant something. He said it with such enthusiasm and such joy. There was something out there that caught his eye. And you know, if you actually looked out the window, it was a beautiful view because the institution was built on the side of a hill, and you looked out and there was a small river that ran by, and there was a very pastoral scene with cows and fields and those sorts of things. It was indeed pretty. So I had been to university and I had studied about data and collecting data and so forth. So I determined that I was going to collect some data, that what I was going to do was every single time that he called me over and called out poco hor, and I'd stand there and I'd look with him and I'd look to see what was there. And then I'd go to the window during periods of time that he wasn't calling out poco hor and see what was not there, to see if I could determine what was there when poco hor was being said and what was not there when poco hor was not being said. So I took my piece of paper, I went over, and I think he was even more excited that I was writing things down, and I stood with him and I looked out as he called poco hor, and I could see the field and I could see the fences and I could see the cows and I could see the river and I could see all the things that were always there, but I couldn't see anything that was never there. So then I'd go over to the window, and when Philip wasn't there and he wasn't calling out poco hor, and I'd look at the scene again and I'd look very, very closely, like you do with those puzzles, to determine what's different in this picture than the picture before, and I really couldn't see anything. Well, I continued on with this for a long period of time, collecting the data, trying to figure out what was there and what was there on a consistent basis and what wasn't there and so forth. But the difficulty was that every time that I went to the window when Philip wasn't standing there to look to see what wasn't poco horing out there, he'd come and stand beside me and get all excited and say, "Poco hor, poco hor." Well, after a period of time, I spoke to the other staff, and they'd all thought that I was very silly and very naive being a brand new staff, and they appreciated the enthusiasm, but they knew, because they had determined over time, that poco hor really didn't mean anything. Well, I finally gave up. I mean, the data really didn't show anything, and I was really disappointed because here I was, brand new into the field, brand new into the life of somebody with a disability, and I wanted to make a difference to that individual. So I eventually told Philip that I wasn't going to be going over to the window anymore, that I don't think that it really meant anything, and and I stopped. I just stopped. And I started doing what all the other staff did, because he would look at other staff and he would call out poco hor, and they'd all say, "Philip, don't be silly, there's nothing out the window, you know that." And I remember the very first time I said to Philip, "Philip, don't be silly, there's nothing out the window, you know that," just like all the other staff did. And there was just a little bit of hurt on his face. And you know, I left the institution and I moved on into a career and all that, and I forgot about Philip. And then during the period of time that the institution itself was closing, I heard that Glendale was closing. I was thinking of my memories there, and one of the very first memories I had was my memory of Philip and him standing at the window and calling out Pocahor, and I thought it was kind of funny, and I thought it was cute, so I decided that I was going to write this story of Philip and Pocahor, and how he'd stand at the window and how he would call me over and how he would trick me with his Pocahor. And then I sat down to this very computer where I'm sitting at right now recording this, and I started to write the story of Pocahor, and about midway through, I stopped, and I got tears in my eyes because for the first time, after all these years, I understood what Pocahor meant. Because Pocahor wasn't something outside the window. Pocahor was something very different. I think what Philip was saying when he said Pocahor was, please come stand at the window with me. Look out. It's a beautiful view. Please come stand at the window with me. I'm feeling lonely, and I want your company. Please stand at the window with me. I never understood what Pocahor meant then. I do now. And I wish somehow that there was a Philip in my life to apologize to.